I'm 29, and for most of my life, I've been the one holding my family together. Not because I wanted to, but because that's just the role I got stuck with. My parents, especially my mother, have always been the type to control everything, from what I wear to how I spend my weekends. If they needed something, it didn't matter what I had going on, I was expected to drop everything. It wasn't just big things, either. Small, everyday decisions weren't really mine to make. If I wanted to spend a weekend away, there would be a guilt trip. If I couldn't come over for dinner, there would be passive-aggressive comments about how family should come first. My mother was the queen of making me feel like I owed her everything. After all we've done for you was her go-to line whenever I hesitated to follow orders. My younger brother, Jake, somehow avoided all of this. He was never expected to do anything, not because he was the favorite, but because he just didn't play their games. If my parents asked him to do something, he would shrug and say no, and that was it. No blow-ups, no guilt trips. It was as if they just accepted that he wouldn't budge, but when it came to me, they refused to take no for an answer. Things had always been this way, but I didn't realize how much control they had over me until I got engaged to Noah. Unlike my family, Noah respected my choices. He actually listened to me. And my parents? They barely tolerated him. He was polite, he never disrespected them, but they hated how he didn't play into their control. The moment we announced our engagement, my mother made it clear that she would be the one planning the wedding. She never even asked what I wanted. She just started making decisions as if it was her event, not mine. I didn't argue at first. I figured I could set some boundaries later, but then they hit me with something so ridiculous that it forced me to finally open my eyes. They sat me down and told me that Noah should take their last name instead of me taking his. They wanted their name to continue, and according to them, it was only fair. They even tried to convince me that this was a normal thing to do. When I laughed and said no, my mother immediately burst into tears. Suddenly, it wasn't about a name anymore. It was about me erasing my family. It's about how she had sacrificed so much for me, and this was how I repaid her. She didn't even try to understand how ridiculous she sounded. To her, this was the ultimate betrayal. The next few days were a mess. I started getting messages from family friends, people I hadn't talked to in months, telling me I should compromise for my parents' sake. Some were subtle, just checking in to see if I was okay because they heard I was having problems with my family. Others were more direct, telling me I needed to fix things before it was too late. My mother had clearly been making calls, spreading her version of the story. Jake, as usual, stayed out of it. When I vented to him about what was happening, he just sighed and said, "You should have seen this coming." And he was right, I should have. But I hadn't realized just how deep their control went until that moment. I had never made a real decision for myself without their interference. Even when I thought I had, they had always been there, nudging, pressuring, making sure things went the way they wanted. For the first time in my life, I told my mother no, and this time, I didn't back down. I could feel the usual panic rising in my chest, the instinct to explain myself, to keep the peace. But I swallowed it down. "No, Mom. I mean it." She blinked, stunned, as if she had never considered the possibility of me refusing her outright. And that's when everything truly fell apart. She didn't just cry this time, she went full meltdown mode. There were screaming phone calls, long messages about how I was destroying the family, and dramatic declarations about how she didn't even recognize me anymore. My father wasn't as emotional, but he wasn't any better. He called once, told me I was being selfish, and hung up before I could even respond. I didn't bother arguing. I had spent years trying to keep the peace, thinking if I just handled things carefully enough, they would eventually respect me. That moment made me realize they never would. So I stopped trying. Instead of explaining myself, I started making silent preparations. Things they would never expect. I stopped picking up their calls. At first, the missed call notifications stacked up, one after another, like they were competing to see who could dial my number the most. Then came the messages. Some were just question marks. Others were long paragraphs about how I was disrespecting my own parents. I didn't answer any of them. The next thing I did was move my savings into a separate account. My parents had never had direct access to my money, but they knew where I banked. They had always operated under the assumption that if I ever needed help managing my finances, they'd be the ones guiding me. So I quietly opened a new account at a different bank, transferred everything over, and closed the old one without saying a word. Then, I made it clear that my mother had no say in the wedding. She had been acting like she was the one getting married, making lists and talking about colors and venues before I had even gotten the chance to. So I told her flat out that Noah and I would be making all the decisions, and that she wasn't going to be involved. The silence on the other end of the call lasted a full 5 seconds before she hung up. That was when the real backlash started. A few days later, I walked into my usual coffee shop and saw them, my parents sitting at a table near the counter, pretending it was just a coincidence that they were there. The moment I ordered my drink, they called my name like they had just spotted me by accident. I turned, and there they were, along with 2 of their closest friends. My mother was already dabbing at her eyes like she had been crying. My father was shaking his head, staring at me like I was some kind of disappointment. They wanted a conversation. They wanted to tell me how much they loved me, how they just wanted to be part of my life, how they couldn't understand why I was shutting them out. They talked about how they had sacrificed so much for me, how they had always wanted the best for me. Then just when it seemed like they were trying to be reasonable, the subtle jabs started. They weren't sure Noah was the right person for me. They were worried I was being influenced by people who didn't really care about family. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. When they finally paused, waiting for me to say something, I smiled, stood up, and told them I had an appointment to get to. Then I left without another word. That appointment? My first therapy session. If my parents knew I was seeing a therapist, they would have lost their minds. They had always looked down on people who sought help, calling them weak and dramatic. But I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to keep trying to untangle their mess alone. When I got home, I made my next move. I sent them a message letting them know they were officially uninvited from the wedding planning process. They weren't banned from the wedding yet, but they wouldn't have a say in anything leading up to it. That's when the messages really started pouring in. My mother sent dozens, each more emotional than the last. She wanted to know how I could do this to her. She begged me to reconsider. Then she got angry. She accused me of being ungrateful, of forgetting everything they had done for me. My father sent a single message, "You're making a mistake." Then the extended family got involved. Suddenly, aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in months were reaching out, telling me I was being selfish. Some tried to sound concerned, asking if something had happened between me and my parents. Others were more direct, calling me cruel for shutting them out. Jake was the only one who didn't take a side. When I mentioned what was going on, he just laughed and said, "I always wondered when you'd snap." Kinda impressive. I thought that was the worst of it, until my parents showed up at my workplace. They walked right into the lobby and asked to see me. The receptionist, who had already seen my phone lighting up with their missed calls, gave me a warning look before letting me know they were there. I barely had time to react before my manager stepped in. She walked up to my parents and politely but firmly told them they couldn't just show up unannounced. My mother, of course, acted like she was being personally attacked. She kept her voice low, but the way she spoke, pleading, almost on the verge of tears, made it sound like I was a terrible daughter who had abandoned them. My father stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to cave. I didn't. My manager didn't either. She repeated, calmly but firmly, that they needed to leave. They hesitated, but when they realized they weren't going to get the reaction they wanted, they finally turned and walked out. That was the moment it hit me. Standing up to them wasn't about fighting. It was about refusing to play their game. The next phase of their meltdown started online. My mother began posting old childhood pictures of me with captions about how much she missed the past. Some of them were harmless, just nostalgic posts about family vacations or school events, but others were clearly aimed at making me look like the bad guy. One had a long, dramatic caption about how family should always come first and how some people forget where they came from. The comments were filled with people sympathizing, asking if everything was okay. I ignored it. I had already stopped following her on social media, but screenshots started coming in from cousins and family friends. Some just sent them with a "thought you should see this," while others asked outright if I was okay. I didn't respond to any of them. If she wanted to play the victim, she could do it without my involvement. Then came the emergency call. My father called, his voice strained, telling me he had been having heart problems. This time, he took a different approach, less anger, more helplessness. He needed to talk before it was too late. The implication was clear. He was trying a new tactic, hoping guilt would work where control had failed. Instead of reacting, I called my aunt, who lived nearby. I casually asked if she had heard anything about my father's health. Her response? He was golfing yesterday. I blocked his number. When that didn't work, my mother tried something even worse. She called the venue where Noah and I had booked our wedding and attempted to convince them to cancel the reservation. She didn't pretend to be me. She wasn't that careless, but she did try to bribe the manager, telling him there had been a mistake and that the booking needed to be changed. Luckily, I had warned the venue in advance. They called me the moment she tried, and I immediately shut it down. I told them under no circumstances should they take any requests from anyone but me or Noah. The manager assured me they wouldn't, and that was that. That was the final straw. I called my mother directly. No anger, no emotion, just cold, direct words. I told her if she interfered again, she wouldn't be invited to the wedding at all. She tried to backpedal, acting like she hadn't meant any harm, but I didn't let her talk her way out of it. I ended the call, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about what she would do next. But she wasn't done. A few days later, she showed up unannounced at Noah's family's house. She wanted to talk. She told them I was making a mistake, that I didn't understand what I was doing, that she just wanted what was best for me. Noah's mother didn't entertain it. She shut it down immediately, telling her that this was between me and my parents, and that she had no right to involve them. When I heard about it, I didn't even get angry. I just sent a message, "No, I'm choosing myself over your control." Jake had always stayed out of the drama, but even he was getting tired of it. He didn't defend me outright, but when our mother started spiraling, he sighed and muttered, "You need to let this go before you make it worse." It wasn't a grand gesture, but for Jake, it was as close as it got to taking a stand. That was when my parents doubled down. They told me if I went through with this, if I kept pushing them away, they would never forgive me. I didn't hesitate. That's your choice, not mine. If for the first time they had nothing left to say. The threats, the guilt, the manipulation, it wasn't working anymore. And that's when I decided it was time to make sure they never had control over me again. After the last call with my mother, I stopped reacting. Arguing wasn't going to change anything. If I wanted to be free of their control, I had to be smarter than them. Instead of cutting them off completely, I decided they needed to see just how little power they had over me. They had spent years controlling me through guilt, manipulation, and public embarrassment. This time, I was going to take that power away, without them even realizing it was happening. I started reaching out to extended family members, the ones I rarely spoke to. It wasn't direct. I didn't call them up and dump everything on them. I just made casual conversation, catching up, seeing where they stood. What I found was surprising. Some of them had their own stories about my parents. They had been manipulated, pressured, or steamrolled in some way too. Not all of them, but enough. I created a private group chat with my cousins and aunts, ones I knew were at least somewhat aware of how my parents operated. I didn't play the victim. I just told them what was happening, laid out the facts, and let them draw their own conclusions. The response was more supportive than I expected. Some had been waiting for someone in the family to finally push back. Others were just tired of the drama my parents created. Either way, I had more backing than I thought. Even Jake started to see it. He had always kept his distance, never fully getting involved, but as my parents' behavior became more erratic, he started noticing just how desperate they were becoming. That was when I came up with the idea. Instead of fighting them, I was going to let them see exactly what they had lost. My wedding was going to be the moment they realized they had no power over me anymore. I told Noah my plan, and he didn't even hesitate. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. We finalized the invitations, making sure to include every family member who had supported us, even the ones who were neutral. The only two names missing? My parents. I didn't tell them. I didn't warn them. I just let it happen. I knew my mother would find out from someone else, and I wanted that. It didn't take long. A week later, my phone lit up with her number. I didn't answer. Minutes later, messages started coming in, not from my parents directly, since I had blocked them, but through other relatives and even unknown numbers. Furious. Demanding to know why they weren't invited, how I could do this to my own family. I waited before responding. Then I sent a single message. I assumed you didn't want to come since you said you'd never forgive me. The silence after that was golden. That was when I made my final move. I called the venue, letting them know there was a chance my parents might try to interfere. The venue manager reassured me that they had security in place and would make sure only invited guests were allowed in. It wasn't a high-profile event, but they understood the importance of keeping things peaceful. This time, my parents had no power, no control, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The night before the wedding, everything was set. The venue was prepped, security had been briefed, and the final guest list was locked in. There was nothing left to do except wait. But instead of feeling nervous, I was excited, not for the wedding itself, but for the moment my parents would finally understand that they had no control over me anymore. Then, late at night, a message came in from my father. It was short, direct, and full of the same guilt-tripping they had used my whole life. You will regret shutting out your own parents on the biggest day of your life. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked his number. Hours later, my mother sent a message from a different number, still trying to get through, but I ignored it. That was the last message I ever acknowledged. The next morning, Jake made a choice that surprised everyone. He had been playing both sides for months, never fully committing to either, but when my parents made one last attempt to turn him against me, he didn't leave with them. He stayed at the wedding, choosing to enjoy himself instead of getting dragged into their tantrum. It wasn't some grand gesture, but it was the first real sign that he was starting to see them for who they really were. Jake had also been feeding me information. My parents had been in full meltdown mode since they found out they weren't invited. The night before, they had ranted about how I had been brainwashed and how they just needed one chance to talk to me. They had convinced themselves that if they showed up, I would fold. Then came the last-minute interference. A family friend, one of my mother's longtime allies, reached out under the guise of just checking in. The conversation started off casually, but it quickly turned into an attempt to mediate between me and my parents. She claimed my mother was devastated and that maybe I should consider letting them come, just to keep the peace. I ended the conversation without giving her an answer. Minutes later, I got a call from Noah's mother. She had heard what was going on and made it clear that she had my back. This is your day. Don't let them ruin it. The venue staff was already prepared. They knew exactly who to watch for and who to keep out. I had even made sure that certain extended family members, ones who had quietly supported me, were seated right at the front. My parents weren't just going to be excluded, they were going to see, firsthand, how many people were on my side. The morning of the wedding was calm, exactly how I wanted it. I got ready with friends, surrounded by love and excitement. Then, right on cue, my parents arrived. They didn't try to sneak in. They walked right up to the entrance, acting like they belonged there. The security guard at the front immediately blocked them, politely but firmly telling them they weren't on the list. My mother didn't take it well. She caused a scene, loud enough that guests inside started whispering. She demanded to see me, shouted about how I was tearing the family apart, even tried to push past the guard. My father stood next to her, quiet but seething, while people gathered nearby, watching. Jake didn't intervene. He didn't defend them, but he also didn't stop them. He just stood back, letting them unravel in front of an audience. The moment stretched on, awkward and humiliating for them. But inside, I was calm. I didn't go out to acknowledge them. I didn't react. I didn't give them what they wanted. Instead, I walked down the aisle, smiling. The ceremony started, and everything was perfect. The venue was beautiful, the guests were smiling, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely free. I stood at the altar with Noah, surrounded by people who actually supported me. And aligned is Wanashi. My parents weren't there, and it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like a relief. Just as the vows were being exchanged, my mother made one last desperate attempt. The doors at the back of the venue rattled, followed by muffled voices. She had shown up again, trying to push her way inside. But this time she wasn't going to get what she wanted. The venue manager had been on alert from the start. Security had already been watching for her, prepared for this exact moment. There was no scene, no screaming, no dramatic outburst. The doors never even opened. She was removed before she could cause a distraction, escorted away as if she was just another uninvited guest. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but that was what made it worse for her. There was no attention, no audience for her breakdown. Inside, the ceremony continued. A few guests glanced toward the back, but most didn't even notice. There was no gasp, no murmuring, just an awkward silence as some family members shifted in their seats, realizing just how far she had fallen. I didn't turn around. I didn't react. I smiled and finished my vows. By the time the reception started, my parents were gone. I made my final move during the speeches. I stood up, raised my glass, and thanked everyone who had supported me. I spoke about love, about family, about the people who stood by me, no matter what. I never mentioned my parents. Not once. Then came the moment that sealed everything. Instead of a father-daughter dance, I danced with Noah's mother. She had been there for me in ways my own mother never had. The message was clear. Jake stayed. He could have left with them, but he didn't. He laughed with guests, had drinks, and for the first time started pulling away from the people who had controlled him his whole life. It wasn't a rebellion. It was just him realizing how much easier things were without the chaos. Later that night, my mother sent one last message. You'll regret this someday. I I didn't bother responding. I blocked her number. For good. Noah and I drove off, surrounded by real family, the one I chose. The wedding ended on a high note, full of love and celebration. Meanwhile, the fallout had already started. The story of what happened spread fast. But for once, it wasn't my reputation that took the hit. It was theirs. After the wedding disaster, my parents did exactly what I expected. They went silent. No messages, no calls, nothing. They thought ignoring me would make me come crawling back, desperate for their attention. But instead of breaking down, I moved on. Life without them was quieter, easier. There were no sudden guilt trips, no manipulations, no emotional outbursts ruining my days. Noah and I focused on our new life together, and for the first time, my time was truly my own. But the fallout wasn't over. Word spread quickly about what happened at the wedding. Some people were neutral, but others started distancing themselves from my parents. The public meltdown at the venue, the way they had embarrassed themselves, it left an impression. People whispered. Some even reached out to me privately asking if I was okay. A few of them admitted they had never realized how bad things were until they saw it for themselves. Jake made his own quiet decision. He didn't go full no contact, but he stopped playing along with their games. No more bailing them out of their self-inflicted disasters, no more being the messenger between me and them. When they called, he answered, but he kept his responses short, detached. That alone was enough to make them panic. Months passed, and then the next attempt came. My mother sent an email, long and dramatic, talking about forgiveness and moving forward as a family. There was no apology, just carefully worded phrases that made it sound like I was the one who had overreacted. I didn't reply. I deleted it. My father never reached out, not once. His pride wouldn't let him. He couldn't handle the fact that I had completely outplayed him. Even after all this time, I still got indirect updates through mutual relatives. My parents were waiting for me to come back, still convinced I would realize my mistake. They never considered that maybe they were the ones who had driven me away. A year later, I attended a family event. I knew they would be there, but I didn't go to see them. I went for the family members who had actually supported me. My mother wasted no time. The moment she saw me, she made sure everyone around her could hear. Liana abandoned her family, she said loudly, her voice full of fake sadness. A few people looked over, waiting to see how I would react. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled and walked away. That was my real victory. I used to think standing up to them would be some dramatic fight, a moment where everything came to a head. But in the end, it wasn't about fighting. It was about taking control of my own life. For years, I thought I needed closure. Now I understand. Some things don't need a dramatic ending. The absence of their control is closure enough.